Hi, everyone. Welcome to Conversations on Zhuangzi. My name's Dominic, and this is my father, Bruce. And we're going to continue this with my brother, Alex, who has had a long passion of learning about Zhuangzi since his early days in college, but he's still kept his long hair. And so Zhuangzi is someone that we haven't heard as much about. We all know who Laozi is, the Tao Te Ching. Give me some context on who Zhuangzi is and how this contrasts to Laozi and the Tao Te Ching.
Daoism has several people who were considered to be the big teachers. In Christianity, we have Jesus. He's a singular figure, so a lot of people think that Laozi, not Lao Tzu, but Laozi, is the equivalent of like a Jesus. Well, he's not. The Taoist tradition has a very clear thing. The question becomes like, well, where did Taoism come from? And as far as the Chinese will go, is that they will say that Taoism came into China from the West. Now, some people have just interpreted that as the mountains to the west of China, and some people have interpreted that as from places off planet. Well, in the case of Laozi, we have the two biggest people in Taoism are Laozi and Zhuangzi. And the main thing about them is that at the simplest level, the world is naturally filled with people who are, by temperament, conservative or liberal. Okay, the hippies were liberal. And as a matter of fact, most of the things that made Zen seem as crazy wisdom, that all came from Zhuangzi. Okay, it didn't come from Laozi, it came from Zhuangzi. And the whole hippie movement, a lot of what they were doing actually came from Zhuangzi again. And the difference is that Laozi was like any old man. He was the old one. Zhuangzi, like in the human race, was the young one. Now, young people are looser and more, let's say, radical than old people are. And they don't assume that old men, old women, what's going to be their big response to all sorts of things? Oh, I've been through this so many times. Let me tell you how it works, kid. Okay, been through it again and again and again. Where the biggest single thing about Zhuangzi is the reliance in terms of achieving enlightenment is through spontaneity. Now, hippies were known for being spontaneous. And I am not trying to make Zhuangzi a hippie. That would be, the hippies had some of the stuff right, and some of the stuff they screwed up royally. It would just depend upon, which group we're talking about. But whenever you see things, the two standard images you have inside of China for Taoist sages, Taoist priests, Taoist immortals, is that you have those who are dressed very conservatively. Usually they've got a beard somewhere down to their belly button. And then you have other people who sometimes will look even half crazed. And they'll be, whereas Laozi would ride on an ox, which is a symbol of ultimate stability. Zhuangzi very often would, God knows what he'd be dressed in. Now, you had a tradition running through China to where you have to realize that the teachings of Zhuangzi also was the basis of a lot of imperial law. Now, I sound like Laozi was the basis of imperial law. It's set from what he did in his ideas, and this is long before Buddhism ever showed up. It was based upon a very measured and a very awareness being quiet and measured. Whereas with Zhuangzi, you'd be talking about wisdom being, as berserk as it could get. It could. which didn't mean they were berserk all the time, but they had that because their guiding principle was to be utterly spontaneous in how the Tao expressed itself in every situation. All right, so they were trying to be in tune with the Tao, where a lot of the programs that came out of Laozi were about how to behave, how to think, how to do whatever, so that would lead you to the Tao. Where Zhuangzi was trying to be right in the middle of the Tao at all times. So, there a lot of the crazy stories you get in Zen, for example, about these crazy wisdom things all over the place, those actually all originally derive from Zhuangzi. And what you had is that those things which were to continue, and it was always talked about them lasting thousands of years, were usually coming from Laozi. Because it's only after you have enough experience, enough spiritual experience, that you can arrive at how spirituality is, how it needs to be done to be able to realistically manifest in a larger number of people. Where in Zhuangzi, his school required a lot of bravery, sheer bravery. Now, as we all know, lots of people, when it comes to things spiritual, they know they should do something, but why don't they? Well, it's because they're afraid. Their ego is under attack, and their ego is terrified with behaving in such and such a way. You don't have anything like that with the Zhuangzi school. So, for example, when you have things where you had people who were Daoist, it was always a thing about how they were high government officials. You know, the equivalent of a president or the governor of a state or a 4-star or 5-star general. And then one day they would just kind of go, well, you know, this is no longer taking me toward the Tao. And they would literally get rid of all their clothes, their jewels, and they'd go out and they'd be in the public dressed in rags. And they would teach people, if people asked them, and they thought the person wasn't a BS artist. But with Laozi, where there were temples, this is where they came from. And with Zhuangzi, there were temples, but they were small. You know, it's a difference between something that has 20 or 30 people in it and something that has 200-300. Now, all of this in the Taoist temples were quite different from the Buddhists, which is a lot of people confuse the two of them. They think that Buddhism and Taoism is kind of the same thing, and it's not. It really isn't. Buddhism had very, very large temple complexes. For example, in Tibet, the Sera and the Ganden each had 7,500 people in it, 7,500 monks. Now, the Taoist tradition in general, and Zhuangzi typifies it much more, was not that big on monks, although they had them. And the purpose of the monks was mostly to run temples. But what is a Taoist temple? Well, this will give you an idea. Societies, religions, part of what they do is try and organize society with some sort of regulated behavior that they call their principles, their commandments, whatever, because they're trying to regulate society. The Taoists realized a long time ago that human beings would have a tendency to eat each other if there wasn't some sort of regulating something or other. So, something you wouldn't get. A person might go to a Christian or a Jewish temple, church, whatever, and they might secretly in their heart of hearts hope to get the names of the winning horses on the Saturday races. Okay? Some would. But in Taoist temples, it'd be rather unambiguous that they'd have their incense sticks and they would go specifically who's going to be the winner at the Saturday races. Like in Hong Kong, where the Hong Kong Jockey Club is like the biggest social institution in Hong Kong, you get people the day or the day or two before or on the day. They're stuffing any little Daoist temple they can get into because they want the crib sheet. They want to know, which horse is going to win because money's had a certain attraction. But one big difference in that Laozi being much more conservative is that anything that is conservative tries to have a set of rules to live by. And they do this very simply because they genuinely believe that most people can't make up their mind how they should live their lives. And so you give them things which will make sure that they won't rob and kill each other and eat their children or eat someone else's children by having some sort of regulation. Whereas Zhuangzi's school wants people to go right out to the edge to where they can start directly intuit what the Tao is trying to tell them to do so that they arrive at what they arrive at through their own experimentation. Not, you should do this, but to do things, no matter if society thinks what you're doing is totally crazy, until you find out what is the root of that inside you. So Zhuangzi's school, like the hippies, did not bow down before the rules of society that much. And Laozi's school did, but it didn't do it in some sort of rigid way. It did it in a very soft way. And there was a much greater appreciation for that knowledge gained through the wisdom of having lived a life and experienced a lot of life was definitely more valuable than winging it. Where Zhuangzi's school winged it. Okay. You would, an example being that if you had some kind of congregation like in America, you wouldn't get the head minister, priest, whatever it is, say, now, you fucker, sit down and listen. You profane the name of the Lord. Where somebody in Zhuangzi's school would do that without blinking, because they would always be trying to go for what the essence of something was. They were radically more interested in essence than they were in the reflections of essence in a mirror. So, as a general rule, it was considered that the people who were involved with the Zhuangzi school had a tendency to be a bit more intelligent, because it takes intelligence to have independent thought. And it also was that they moved through society very freely. They didn't care how they dressed. They didn't care how they looked. They didn't care how they looked, as long as in some way that was echoing what the Tao was, or Christian terms, they were actually listening to what God was telling them to do. And they didn't make excuses about the way they acted, unless there were other conservative groups in China, such as the Confucians, which they stayed away from. Because the Confucians, if you didn't say things the way they wanted you to say it, essentially would execute you. Okay, so now we're talking about that Confucianism has a very strong affinity with what we would call dictatorship, where Zhuangzi didn't. But a big part of Zhuangzi is that by allowing oneself to freely express what was in one, at the beginning of it, there was the pure understanding that people were still going to go back to whatever their habitual patterns were. But then as they got used to being more free with what they were saying, they would slowly start being able to penetrate right to the core of their being, where the truth of the matter was, and that is the only place the Tao is going to be found. It's not going to be found in how you dress, how you talk, where you live, what your status is. So it was quite common, as I said. It was even common that generals in the middle of a battle would drop everything and leave, and then go up into the mountains to explore what they were, or do it at the end of the battle when normally the general would go to the emperor to get all these rewards. And they'd say, keep your rewards. That is not going to help one to understand what the Tao is. That is not going to help someone to understand what enlightenment is. It's not going to do it. So if it's not going to do it, I'm sorry. You know, my thing is being a student of the Tao, which means I have to try and somehow get in coordinate. So they never really had the problem of, you know, everybody's a sinner, but they don't want to admit it. Okay? They never really had that because they didn't have anything as a general rule that was mandated about how they should live or how they should act or what they should do. But the mandate that they did have was to explore that which was inside them until they could actually realize what was at their core and have a bridge to the universe.
Okay, you did a fantastic job of explaining who Zhuangzi is and his tradition and how that contrasts with Laozi and his tradition and how that kind of completes the Taoist tradition as a whole.
Well, I didn't say as a whole because I didn't go into the A's and I didn't go into Mengzi, which were, you know, kind of sitting in the middle ground between Laozi and Zhuangzi.
You've discussed before about the fire tradition and the water tradition, the fire tradition being Zhuangzi and the water tradition being Laozi. You have had experience in both?
To be accurate.
Yeah.
The fire and the water traditions is more about how you practice. And there is. People get very confused. I mean, they will confuse Laozi and Zhuangzi with the fire and water traditions. I was explaining what both Laozi and Zhuangzi have fire and water traditions. Okay. Fire traditions were a little bit more common with Zhuangzi for the simple reason that spiritual progress for those who have the courage can be much faster. But you also have the problem that with the fire traditions, too many people get really hurt. And then, you know, what is it? You know, 2 steps forward, 4 steps back. So that they never actually get to what the deeper things are because they got trash from doing practice that were too extreme. And the basic difference between fire and water is that fire traditions will sometimes get very extreme, but water traditions never will get extreme.
So now we kind of understand Zhuangzi and his tradition. Let's talk about his text, the aptly named Zhuangzi, very creative name. When I was in China and I spoke to a lot of professors and students, they learned Zhuangzi purely as a philosophical text, not a spiritual one. What are they missing, and how does that tie into you learning the Taoist arts?
First of all, they also thought in China that Laozi was a philosophical tradition. And here I'll try and make this point really simply. In the spiritual traditions of the world, there are 2 major subdivisions. One is that of practitioners who actually want to become one with God. You don't want to know about God. You want to talk to him personally, like I'm talking to you. So that are active practitioners who are trying to fulfill the principles that are in the philosophy. Now, but then for many religions, the philosophy becomes a thing and they don't really focus or have that great a bridge into what the spiritual side of it is. So, you know, if someone steals something, a Muslim will cut off their hand. Now, I don't know if cutting their hand is going to change that which is within their character, that which is within them, that they would never even think to steal. It would never arise inside them. Jesus Christ, treat your neighbor as yourself. Most people are way too egocentric to do that. Me first, everybody else, get whatever scraps are left. Now that's so the difference between a spiritual philosophy is like any philosophy. It is stating how you should live, what should be the undercurrents of your behaviors in society. Where spirituality doesn't really care much about that. It cares about how, in the human experience of going through society, it can bring them closer to a realization of spiritual reality.
Can you talk more about the specific text of the Zhuangzi and how it teaches you to be able to do these inner practices that you just discussed?
First of all, that is what your brother is going to do. He's doing the specific chapters in the Zhuangzi. And a lot of what's in the whole school of Zhuangzi and Daoism is not. Sometimes from reading the text, you couldn't get that it's not a dictum. It's not something that this must be done. And there's lots of things that aren't mentioned. And they were passed down through the masters of the tradition. Anything that is basically a literary tradition of spirituality is a philosophical text. Because when you start getting down to what the reality of it is, that only can be passed on from human being to human being.
So delving into that, and as you mentioned, as we go forward, our brother Alex will be going chapter by chapter with you. How were you taught the Zhuangzi? Did you guys go chapter by chapter? Were you more just taught things and then they mentioned it?
We just taught whatever the teachers wanted to teach. We did some things in groups. We did some things that were one-on-one with the masters. And that was it. Since at that time, I could not read classical Chinese. And to tell you the truth, nor could most Chinese. Okay? The issue is that those are words. Words are not living things. They're dead ideas that are pointing toward living things. But the words of a text are not alive.
Are there any additional things people should kind of be aware about or kind of do anything internally before you go into each of the chapters, before they kind of learn more about Zhuangzi?
Well, first of all, the chapters in Zhuangzi usually went through long periods of time before even the book was mentioned about what were the practices, what were the things that you were trying to do that would eventually start moving you in the direction of the Tao. And that's not just quoting dead words from dead pages. That was much more employed in the Confucian schools of Chinese spirituality.
So as we wrap up this lesson, why do you think Laozi is so much more well-known, especially in the West, than Zhuangzi?
Oh, as I said, Laozi was incorporated into the imperial laws. It was a basis that when you went to a judge, those were texts that they had to learn and that they had to rule on decisions about whatever the decisions were. That's the reason why. Zhuangzi was never that big a part of the imperial law system.
In your own practice, how has the teachings of Zhuangzi helped you in ways that the teaching of Laozi hasn't?
Well, I would say step number one was that when I was first in China, I came from America. And I had all sorts of what I would call spiritually contracted ideas and philosophies. And Zhuangzi helped me get past that. The second one is that I was a bit of a free spirit. And I would have to say that Zhuangzi unlocked that free spirit in me to a degree that the works of Laozi didn't.
So would you say then that you think that the temperament kind of culture of Americans delves a little better with Zhuangzi and his tradition?
Well, I would have to say what sections of American culture. Look, currently, what is the big bugaboo on the political scene is Donald Trump. His MAGA people are conservative as hell. They're not particularly liberal. Where you had some of the more extreme wings of the Democratic Party are more liberal. But the fact of the matter is that I don't. To a conservative way of thinking, the past is more important than the future because the past gives benchmarks in what will happen if you do X, Y, and Z. The past is what the rulers of society have always tried to use as their backstop. Okay, you go back to ancient Egypt, you don't have liberal thinking pharaohs. You had conservative ones. And when the objective is to build empires, to control massive numbers of people, then the ways of Laozi can easily be twisted to appear to be that. Although Laozi was not in truth a conservative, but in terms of the whole range of what was in Daoism. I mean, for example, Laozi's school had sexual practices, but they were not out there anywhere as far as they were with Zhuangzi. And that was because Laozi's whole thing was living a very measured life. And Zhuangzi's was not. It wasn't that Zhuangzi was against a measured life. To him, it was irrelevant. Which Laozi, it was very, very, very relevant. And then, all their little things about what you do and what you don't do, what you should believe, what you shouldn't believe, all flow from those basic principles.